June 1982, the Bekaa Valley, eastern Lebanon. The sky is blisteringly blue. Beneath it, the valley simmers in heat and smoke. At 30,000 feet, a squadron of Israeli F-15 Eagles cruises silently above the chaos, their pilots scanning radar scopes that blink with fast-closing dots. Below them, Soviet-built MiG-21s and MiG-23s, flying for Syria, climbing hard to intercept. They're moving fast, confident, vectored in by ground radar. They've fought wars before. They've trained for this. What they haven't seen, what they can't see, is the range. An F-15 pilot keys his radio, confirms target lock, and squeezes the trigger. The AM-7 Sparrow missile launches in a blur. 30 seconds later, a Syrian MiG explodes mid-air, without warning, without return fire. Then another. Then 3 more. Within 2 days, the valley becomes a graveyard. More than 80 Syrian aircraft are shot down. Most never even saw their attackers. 0 F-15s are lost. For the Israeli Air Force, it's the most one-sided air victory since the dawn of the jet age. For the Syrians, it's a massacre. And back in Moscow, the Soviet High Command is stunned. Their aircraft, the pride of the MiG design bureaus, exported to allies across the globe, are being hunted and destroyed with surgical precision. These weren't outdated relics. They were frontline fighters. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, fast, agile, reliable. They had dominated the skies in Vietnam, crushed opponents in Egypt, brought fear to NATO planners for decades. But in the skies above Lebanon, they're reduced to smoke trails. And the weapon that did it, the F-15 Eagle, isn't stealthy. It's not invisible. It's not even new. It's just better. It flies higher. It sees farther. It kills from beyond visual range, and then disappears into the clouds. In Soviet war rooms, the explanations come quickly. Syrian pilots were undertrained. Ground control failed. The Americans helped with AWACS. But none of that can explain the numbers. None of that can explain how a single fighter, flying alone or in pairs, can wipe out entire squadrons before ever being seen. The Soviets had laughed at the Eagle, called it bloated, inefficient, a symbol of American excess. But now, in the burning skies over the Middle East, that joke is vaporizing their credibility. And this is just the beginning. Because the next time the F-15 goes to war, it won't just be MiG-21s in its crosshairs. It'll be MiG-25s, MiG-29s, MiG doctrine itself, and none of it will survive. Zhukovsky Airfield, outside Moscow. In the thick of the Cold War, a classified group of Soviet air defense planners gathers to analyze a new threat: the American F-15 Eagle. The CIA had leaked hints. Photos from satellite overflights at Edwards Air Force Base show a large, twin-tailed, twin-engine fighter. U.S. media calls it a super fighter. The Soviets call it a mistake. "Too large," one colonel mutters. "It will bleed energy in a turning. Fight." "Twin-engine redundancy means weight," says another. "No way it can out-dogfight a MiG-21. Their assumptions are rooted in a deeply held belief. Air superiority lies in speed and simplicity. The Soviet MiG doctrine is built on fast interceptors, nimble delta-wing fighters, and ground-guided engagements. The F-15, by contrast, appears bloated, an engine with wings. The MiG-23 is their answer. Variable geometry wings, high-speed intercepts, rapid climb rates, smaller, faster, cheaper, built in mass numbers and exported globally. To Soviet designers, dogfighting remains the ultimate test. Their top aces speak of combat in loops and rolls, of cannon fire at 800 meters, of turning radius and thrust to weight. Close-in kills, not long-range ambushes. They look at the F-15 and see everything that contradicts their logic: radar-first tactics, missiles over maneuvering, weight over speed, electronics over instinct. In 1975, the KGB's Directorate T delivers a technical brief on the Eagle. High-thrust engines, radar with BVR capability, advanced HUD, unconfirmed look-down, shoot-down capacity, intended for air dominance roles. But that last line, the one that matters, is laughed off. "No fighter flies alone," says one Air Force major. "Not without ground radar, not in war." What they don't know, what they refuse to believe, is that the Eagle was built to hunt solo. While Soviet pilots train with ground control intercept, GCI, Eagle pilots are taught to operate independently, to find, fix, and finish targets using only onboard systems, no vectors, no third-party calls, just radar, missiles, and intent. And that radar, APG-63, isn't just powerful, it's revolutionary, track while scan, look down, shoot down, able to detect low-flying aircraft against ground clutter, something Soviet radars still struggle with. Even worse, American doctrine doesn't even prioritize close combat. Eagle pilots train to kill at range, beyond visual, before warning. But in this room of Soviet planners, those ideas sound insane. You don't shoot what you can't see. You don't trust electronics over pilot instinct. You don't train for kills at 30 kilometers. You train for kills at 3. So they file the F-15 under overbuilt, expensive, over-specialized, not a threat. Their own MiG program is leaner, proven, safe, and so they believe, confidently, that if war ever comes, their fighters will hold the skies. But confidence isn't a shield, and arrogance is no match for range. For decades, Soviet air combat doctrine followed a simple principle. Fighters do not operate alone. Every Soviet aircraft, whether MiG-21, MiG-23, or later the MiG-29, was an extension of a broader command structure. Pilots didn't hunt. They followed vectors. Their eyes were ground radar. Their orders came from command bunkers, and their targets were fixed in by ground-controlled intercept, GCI systems. This was how the Soviet Union believed air. Superiority would be won. Rapid climb rates, GCI vectors to the threat, close-range intercept, massed formations, fast, decisive missile shots. The pilot was a trigger, not a tactician. Missile range mattered, but not as much as getting close. Dogfighting wasn't a risk. It was the goal. Soviet fighters were lighter, faster, and more agile, precisely because the system assumed they'd be flown into a furball guided by radar stations and overwhelmed the enemy in numbers. That doctrine worked, for a time. In Vietnam, Soviet-designed MiGs proved deadly. MiG-17s and MiG-21s, when flown in tight formations with solid GCI support, outmaneuvered U.S. F-4 Phantoms. They shredded bombers, forced policy changes. The Soviet Air Force saw that and doubled down. The MiG-23 was born as the interceptor of the future. It could outrun most NATO fighters. It had swing wings for flexibility. And it could fire R-23 missiles, Soviet equivalents to the American Sparrow. In theory, it was everything a fast response force needed. But the F-15 didn't come to fight fair. The F-15 wasn't designed around close combat or defensive vectors. It was designed around the kill chain. From detection to missile lock, from first radar ping to splashdown, it was engineered to win the air war before the dogfight ever began. Its radar didn't need command support. Its missiles, AIM-7 Sparrows, and later AIM-120 AMRAAMs, could hit at ranges well beyond visual contact. Its twin engines gave it unmatched thrust-to-weight ratio, enabling it to climb, dive, and out-accelerate anything in the Soviet inventory. Even its cockpit layout was built for supremacy. A head-up display gave Eagle pilots data without distraction. Hands-on throttle and stick, HOTAS systems, meant less time reaching, more time killing. But the key difference wasn't hardware. It was doctrine. F-15 pilots were taught to kill from a distance, to rely on radar over instinct, to fire without fear of overextension. They didn't wait for the enemy. They controlled the engagement. In contrast, Soviet pilots still trained for gun kills, visual ID, high-G turns, rear aspect locks. Even the famed MiG-29, which would debut years later, carried the dogfighting DNA of an earlier era. That disconnect between technology and doctrine was fatal. Because when the first F-15s met Soviet-designed MiGs in real combat, it wasn't a clash of equals, it was an execution, and the doctrine that had once terrified NATO was about to become a liability. June 9, 1982. Over the Bekaa Valley, the air turns lethal. Israeli F-15s and F-16s, supported by electronic warfare aircraft, enter Syrian-controlled airspace. It's a trap, one the Syrians don't see coming. Their radar is jammed. Their GCI stations, modeled on Soviet doctrine, are blind, and their pilots are flying into the kill box. The F-15 Eagles lead the strike package, flying high cover. Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s scramble in response. What happens next is the most one-sided air battle since Korea. Within minutes, the first Syrian MiGs are falling. The kills come fast, and from distances the Syrians never trained for. The F-15s are launching AIM-7 Sparrow missiles from beyond 30 kilometers, guided by advanced radar that Soviet airframes can't see, track, or jam. MiGs never receive missile warnings. Their countermeasures, if they deploy at all, fail instantly. An Israeli F-15 flight, callsign Spark 3, engages 5 MiG-23s. Within 40 seconds, 3 are destroyed. The remaining 2 flee, pursued by F-16s below. The MiG pilots never see the missiles, only flashes in the sky, then fire. By the end of the first day, Syrian Air Command has lost 29 aircraft. Most were downed before visual contact. None of the Israeli F-15s were even scratched. Soviet observers embedded with Syrian command units are horrified. They transmit urgent reports to Moscow. Losses unsustainable. Enemy aircraft engage from beyond radar range. Syrian air defenses ineffective. MiG performance severely degraded in jamming conditions. But the numbers keep climbing. By the third day, over 80 Syrian aircraft are destroyed. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, Isu-22s, all victims of coordinated long-range ambushes. The Eagle's APG-63 radar proves decisive. It tracks multiple targets at once, distinguishes them from ground clutter, and hands off missiles with cold precision. Even when Syrian MiGs attempt low-altitude escape tactics, the F-15s maintain radar lock and fire. This isn't combat. It's a system executing an algorithm of death. Back in Syria's operations bunker, Soviet officers argue. Some blame the terrain. Others suspect American AWACS support. But none of it explains the speed of the kills or the zero Israeli losses. And most of all, none of it explains the F-15's immunity. The MiGs never score a hit. Even when fired upon, the Eagles simply outclimb, outroll, and outrun every threat. They carry more fuel, accelerate faster, and fire first. The Soviets are left with a terrifying realization. They've built a fighter doctrine around visibility and response. But the Americans have built an aircraft that kills without being seen. No warning, no maneuver, no survival. Just missile lock and silence. The reports from Lebanon arrive wrapped in disbelief. Syrian squadrons devastated. MiG-21s and MiG-23s downed in droves. Israeli F-15s untouched. In a subterranean conference hall within the Soviet Air Defense Command, senior officers pore over intercepted radio traffic, mission logs, and AWACS traces shared by sympathetic contacts in the region. Every data point tells the same story. F-15s are dominating the sky, and they're doing it cleanly. To the generals in the room, this is unacceptable. General Koldunov, head of Soviet Air Defense Forces, slams a report to the table. "Propaganda," he growls. "No aircraft flies without losses." The others nod, relieved by the simplicity of the denial. The idea That one aircraft, a Western one, no less, could destroy entire squadrons of Soviet-built fighters without a single confirmed loss is too humiliating to accept. The default response is one word: disinformation. The claims are dismissed as Israeli exaggeration. "They lie to bolster morale," one colonel offers. "Inflated numbers, fake telemetry." The Syrians, Moscow insists, must have panicked. Their pilots weren't properly trained. Their air defense operators were under stress. Ground control failed. It wasn't the fault of the aircraft. It was user error. Still, the private doubts begin to spread. Behind closed doors, Soviet analysts dissect what little black box data they can access. One chilling trend emerges. Many MiGs never fired a shot. Most Syrian fighters were downed before they could even acquire a target. That can't be explained by poor training alone. By mid-June, a preliminary internal assessment, marked strictly confidential, lands on the desk of the Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff. It concludes, "Evident technological superiority in radar performance and missile coordination. Engagements took place outside visual range. Syrian GCI systems were completely disrupted. MiG losses attributed to delayed detection and inferior missile range." No one wants to read that. No one dares share it up the chain. Instead, a sanitized report is produced for political consumption. Israeli kill claims exaggerated. Syrian command fractured. MiGs overwhelmed by numerically superior force. Ground radar sabotage suspected. These are convenient lies. They preserve the illusion that Soviet equipment, when operated properly, still reigns supreme. But the truth is out there. It's flying 10,000 meters above the Bekaa Valley. It's loitering with a full missile load, waiting to strike again. And it's undefeated. Moscow can't say that aloud. Because to admit that would be to admit something worse. That their most iconic fighter designs have just been made obsolete by a machine they never truly understood. The Eagle. It doesn't dogfight. It doesn't hesitate. It kills from beyond reach, and nothing they've built can stop it. As pressure mounts inside the Soviet defense establishment, a new theory emerges to soothe the sting of the Bekaa Valley disaster. The problem wasn't the MiGs, it was the pilots. Soviet leadership turns its ire not on the aircraft, but on the Syrians. They blame the humiliating losses on poor tactics, disorganized formations, and a lack of discipline. To preserve the credibility of Soviet design, Moscow declares, "Our fighters are fine. Our clients simply misused them." The official line spreads quickly. Had Soviet pilots been at the controls, the results would have been different. It's a comforting delusion. They point to radar mismanagement. The Syrians failed to coordinate ground control. They launched piecemeal responses. They sent MiG-21s, designed in the 1950s, against fourth-generation opponents. Of course they lost. But this theory misses one crucial fact. MiG-23s were there too, and they died just as fast. These weren't relics. The MiG-23 was Moscow's answer to the F-4 Phantom. It had swing wings, radar-guided missiles, and speeds topping Mach 2. Soviet pilots had praised its climb rate and acceleration, and yet, in the hands of the Syrians, they were destroyed en masse. Not in turn fights, not in missile exchanges, but before they even fired. Still, the incompetent ally theory persisted. In July 1982, Soviet air defense issued a classified training manual revision, doubling down on this view. Client air forces must be retrained in proper interceptor tactics. Soviet equipment, when utilized within doctrine, remains effective against NATO designs. But this raises another uncomfortable question. What doctrine? Soviet MiG pilots are taught to follow radar vectors, to acquire targets visually, to engage within limited missile envelopes. None of those tactics matter when the enemy is already firing from 30 kilometers away. Behind the scenes, simulations begin at Zhukovsky. GRU technicians pit MiG-23s against theoretical F-15 intercepts, using captured data from Lebanon. The results are grim. Time to detection, F-15 wins. First missile launch, F-15 wins. Probability of kill, F-15 wins. Survivability, MiG is dead before merge. The simulations are classified, the conclusions buried. Publicly, the MiG remains capable. Internally, the message is clear. If the MiG-23 meets the F-15 in the sky, it dies. Still, Soviet commanders stick to their line. The next war, they say, will be different. Better pilots, better integration, more MiGs, newer tactics. But no amount of pilot skill can change a missile's range, and no doctrine survives when the other side rewrites the rules of air combat. The MiGs weren't misused. They were outclassed, from radar to weapons, from altitude to situational awareness, from the first ping to the final explosion. The F-15 had the edge, not because the pilots were better, but because the jet was built to dominate. When the pilot blame narrative starts to buckle under the weight of evidence, Soviet strategists pivot to a new theory, one that seems more stable, more politically useful. The Eagle, they now claim, is unsustainable. It might be lethal, yes, but it's too big, too expensive, too complex, built for peacetime showdowns, not sustained conflict. A luxury fighter with a cost that ensures it can never be fielded in numbers. This theory becomes the new talking point inside Soviet Air Force journals and classified assessments. The F-15 cannot be mass-produced without bankrupting its sponsor nation. It is a high-value target. Once losses mount, production gaps will render it ineffective. It's a belief rooted in Soviet design culture. The MiG-21 cost less than $2 million to build. The MiG-23, even with upgrades, was fielded by the hundreds across the Warsaw Pact. Numbers were a weapon. So was speed of manufacture. The F-15, on the other hand, was a behemoth. Twin engines, digital avionics, high-maintenance radar systems. Its flyaway cost in the early 1980s hovered around $30 million per aircraft. In Soviet eyes, that made it a white elephant, powerful but fragile, unsustainable in a real war of attrition. Then came the Gulf War, January 1991. U.S. F-15Cs lead the air campaign against Iraq, home to one of the most heavily equipped Soviet client air forces in the world. The Iraqis field MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-25s, and even a handful of MiG-29s. Backed by radar networks and ground-based SAMs, they brace for the onslaught. The F-15s arrive and start killing immediately. Day 1, a MiG-29 downed at long range by a Sparrow missile. Day 2, MiG-25 scrambled, shot down before reaching intercept range. By day 5, over a dozen Iraqi fighters fall. By the end of the campaign, 32 confirmed air-to-air kills by F-15s. 0 losses. Not one Eagle falls to enemy fire. And far from being too rare to matter, F-15s dominate the sky in every engagement zone. They fly hundreds of sorties. They coordinate with AWACS, but never depend on them. They conduct sweeps, escorts, patrols, and they win every fight. Suddenly, the unsustainable theory collapses. The U.S. isn't deploying a few F-15s. It's deploying squadrons, maintaining uptime, swapping parts, running sorties around the clock, and every one of those Eagles is performing with machine-like consistency. Meanwhile, Iraqi MiG-29s, the crown jewel of Soviet exports, are obliterated in minutes. Their radar can't match, their missile range falls short, their ground control vectors them into kill zones they don't know they're entering. The data devastates Soviet observers. One GRU briefing, marked Top Secret, Eyes Only, summarizes the dilemma. Western assumptions about high-cost platforms do not hinder battlefield effectiveness. F-15s show no decline in combat capability across sustained missions. MiG losses indicate not just tactical weakness, but strategic inferiority. In one strike, the myth of unsustainable American superiority dies. And in its place, a colder truth. The Americans built fewer aircraft because they didn't need more. One F-15 could do what 3 MiGs could not. And even if the Soviets could field more jets, they couldn't field more time, because the Eagle would find them before they ever saw it coming. In the vast apparatus of Soviet military intelligence, no name carried more weight than the GRU, the main intelligence directorate. Their mission? Track and evaluate Western capabilities, identify threats, and ensure Soviet strategic superiority. But when it came to the F-15 Eagle, they missed everything. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, the GRU focused its aerial assessments on the F-117 Nighthawk, the emerging stealth bomber. It was novel. It was black. It disappeared from radar. That made it terrifying. The F-15? Too conventional. Too visible. Too American. Their analysts dismissed it as a stopgap between the Phantom and whatever stealth monstrosity Lockheed would build next. The GRU's own modeling programs underestimated its radar performance, assumed missile ranges exaggerated, and completely ignored the doctrinal revolution behind its design. Meanwhile, the KGB's Directorate T, responsible for technical espionage, was funneling back aerospace intelligence stolen from American contractors. But even their reports failed to highlight the F-15's most critical edge. It was not just a fighter. It was a fully integrated kill system. Soviet assessments repeatedly listed the F-15 as maneuverable, well-powered, and radar-capable, but never understood the fusion. That its radar wasn't just better, it was integrated with weapons and targeting in real time. That its pilots weren't just trained, they were taught to dominate independently. Worse, the VVS, Soviet Air Force Command, never corrected the record. They continued training MiG-23 and MiG-29 pilots for close-range engagements. They emphasized ground vectoring, rear aspect missile locks, visual ID. No real-time scenario training included long-range missile duels or independent radar kills, because in Soviet doctrine, no kill happens without ground control. Then came the 1991 Gulf War. The GRU scrambled to analyze U.S. air campaigns in Iraq. What they saw shattered every assumption. F-15s operated autonomously, engaged at extreme distances, downed MiG-25s and MiG-29s without visual contact. Iraq's ground-controlled intercept procedures, mirror images of Soviet systems, completely failed to position fighters for a counterstrike. In a now declassified GRU simulation run post-Gulf War, Soviet technicians recreated an engagement between an F-15 and a MiG-29 over the Persian Gulf. The MiG never locked its radar. The F-15 fired at 35 kilometers. Kill probability, 93%. Time from launch to impact, 28 seconds. Time before the MiG pilot registered a threat, 0. The final report, marked Eyes Only, Strategic Implications, concluded, Soviet and Allied interceptor doctrine is rendered obsolete when facing aircraft with independent long-range detection and engagement capabilities. MiG platform survivability cannot be guaranteed against Eagle-type threats. But this truth came too late. The GRU had spent a decade tracking the wrong ghost. They watched for stealth, while the F-15 carved smoking trails through the Middle East. They modeled dogfights, while American pilots never needed to see their enemy. They built doctrine for intercepts, while the Eagle wrote a new language for air superiority. By the time Soviet generals understood the failure, it was irreversible. The F-15 didn't outfly their jets, it outthought them, and Soviet intelligence didn't even see it coming. The Soviets believed they were competing against another fighter. But the F-15 Eagle was not just a fighter. It was the airborne executioner of an entire doctrine. At its heart was the McDonnell Douglas F-15C, a 20-meter-long machine, twin-engined, all-weather, designed for one mission: absolute air dominance. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't stealthy, but it didn't need to be, because what it had was everything else. Start with the radar. The AN/APG-63. This was no ordinary pulse Doppler system. It could track 14 targets simultaneously, lock 4, and engage 2 at once, all at beyond visual range, and it worked in look-down, shoot-down mode, detecting low-flying targets even against heavy ground clutter. Soviet MiGs? Their radar often failed below 5,000 feet. Now pair that with the AM-7 Sparrow, and later the AM-120, AMRAAM. The Sparrow had a max range of 70 kilometers, semi-active guidance, and could be fired before the pilot even saw his enemy. The AMRAAM, deployed in later stages, was fully active, autonomous, and faster than any Soviet pilot could respond to. And inside the jet, everything was built for speed. 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines delivered more than 50,000 pounds of combined thrust. That gave the Eagle a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1.1, meaning it could accelerate vertically. It could climb 30,000 feet in under a minute, cruise at Mach 2.5, and still dogfight at subsonic speeds. Every control was HOTAS, hands on throttle and stick. No reaching, no fumbling, just lethal control. And every pilot sat beneath a canopy with 360-degree visibility, supported by a heads-up display feeding radar data, missile status, and threat warnings, all in real time, all while pulling 9Gs. But the magic wasn't just hardware. It was how everything worked together. An F-15 wasn't just a fast jet with long missiles. It was a flying sensor fusion node, able to engage before enemy pilots even knew they were targeted. MiG-23s and MiG-29s still relied on visual identification. The F-15 didn't. They fired short-range IR missiles. The Eagle fired from 40 kilometers away. They needed guidance from radar command. The Eagle was its own commander, and it wasn't flying solo. American strategy fused F-15s with AWACS aircraft, electronic warfare, and satellite intelligence. That meant Eagle pilots knew where their enemies were, before their enemies knew they were airborne. During Desert Storm, this system was tested to its limit. F-15 pilots engaged Iraqi MiG-29s, Soviet-designed, agile, brand new. The MiG-29s never scored a single kill. F-15s destroyed 5 in under 72 hours. Then came MiG-25s, Mach 2.8 monsters once feared across NATO. They were outturned, out-tracked, and shot down while retreating. In 1991 alone, F-15s scored over 30 air-to-air kills, all against Soviet-made aircraft, with 0 losses. The Soviets couldn't understand it. They saw jets. But they missed the system. They assumed the fight was between MiG and Eagle, but it was actually between single-platform doctrine and full-spectrum integration. The F-15 was just the tip of the spear. Behind it stood AWACS, jamming, satellites, training, logistics, tactics. The Americans didn't just build a plane, they built a kill chain. And the F-15 was the sharp end. January 17, 1991. The opening night of Operation Desert Storm. Iraq scrambles its best. MiG-29 Fulcrums, the pride of Soviet design. Fast, agile, deadly on paper. Backed by MiG-23s and MiG-25s, Saddam's Air Force was the 4th largest in the world. Soviet advisors predicted it would hold its own. Within hours, the first MiG-29 is gone. An F-15C flying cap, Combat Air Patrol, intercepts the Iraqi jet over western Iraq. Radar contact is made at 45 kilometers. The Eagle fires a Sparrow, 1 missile, 1 kill. The MiG never locked radar. The pilot never saw his killer. This is how it begins. By sunrise, 6 more Iraqi fighters are destroyed. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-29s, all downed without a single Eagle loss. Many never fire a shot. Some are retreating. None escape. Then, on January 19th, the most infamous engagement of the air war occurs. An Iraqi MiG-25 Foxbat, one of the fastest interceptors ever built, challenges two F-15s over central Iraq. Soviet planners once believed the Foxbat could outclimb and outrun anything America had. What they never accounted for was what happened before the merge. The Eagle locks on first, missile away. The MiG-25 tries to evade, dives to Mach 2.2, punches chaff. But it's not enough. The AIM-7 detonates meters from the airframe, one of the world's fastest aircraft, downed by something it couldn't see. By January 30th, the tally is 28 kills for the F-15, not a single loss. And this isn't against second-rate junk. These are Soviet frontline aircraft, flown by pilots trained under Soviet doctrine, using Soviet tactics. They're being wiped out in record time. American pilots describe the engagements as unfair. One Eagle driver put it bluntly. "We were playing with night vision, long-range radar, and high-speed missiles. They were flying blind." And worse, many Iraqi MiG pilots refuse to engage. They flee the battle space the moment F-15s appear on radar. In Baghdad, Soviet advisors are stunned. This wasn't just about training anymore. It wasn't about inferior tactics. The numbers were clear. MiG-29, 0 kills, 5 losses. MiG-25, 0 kills, 6 losses. MiG-23, 0 kills, 8 losses. MiG-21, 0 kills, 10+ losses. F-15C, undefeated one encounter sums up the humiliation. February 5th, an F-15C pilot locks onto a fleeing MiG-23. The MiG deploys, flares, and dives. The Eagle maintains radar lock, waits for the escape angle, then launches. The missile chases the MiG for 20 seconds before impact. The MiG never knew it was being hunted until it exploded. In total, F-15s logged over 100 air-to-air victories throughout the Cold War and Gulf War combined, with 0 losses. That's not combat. That's domination. And for Soviet strategists, watching their most advanced platforms turned to scrap metal by a machine they once laughed at, it's a reckoning. Their doctrine failed. Their fighters failed. Their entire theory of air combat collapsed in the jet stream of the Eagle. Because in every battle, the F-15 didn't just win. It made sure the other side never stood a chance. By the spring of 1991, Soviet military doctrine lay in ruins, not because of tanks or missiles, but because of what happened in the sky. For decades, Soviet aerospace theory had rested on key pillars: superiority in numbers, simplified high-speed aircraft, ground-based radar command, close-range combat dominance. Each of these assumptions had now been obliterated, not by stealth, but by the F-15 Eagle. In just 6 weeks, the Eagle had done what NATO planners dreamed of for 40 years. It rendered the entire Warsaw Pact air strategy obsolete. The Fulcrum? Outranged. The Foxbat? Out-tracked. The Flogger? Out-fought. And none of them ever stood a chance. For Soviet defense officials, the shock wasn't just technical, it was ideological. They had always believed that Western systems were too expensive, too fragile, too complex to survive in real war. The F-15 crushed that belief on live television. They had built the MiG-29 as the equalizer, a frontline answer to NATO air power, with helmet sight technology, IRST, and high agility. But in Iraq, MiG-29s never scored a single confirmed air-to-air kill, because none of it mattered. Not agility, not infrared sensors, not tight-turning combat, because the war never got that close. The F-15's victories weren't just a matter of hardware, they were victories of doctrine. American air combat strategy emphasized pre-merge superiority: kill first, kill far, never be seen. And when the F-15 was given real combat autonomy, it executed that vision flawlessly. Meanwhile, Soviet pilots, trained for ground-directed dogfights, were flying blind into BVR, beyond visual range, kill zones. It was a massacre of expectations. An internal VVS, Soviet Air Force review, circulated secretly among senior command in 1992, admitted the defeat plainly. Our current fighter inventory cannot guarantee airspace dominance against NATO platforms operating with independent targeting capabilities. Countermeasures are insufficient. Training is mismatched. Tactical reform is required immediately. But the admission came too late. The USSR itself was crumbling. The Cold War was ending not with a bang, but with a shrug of inevitability. The Americans had built a system, a machine, a doctrine, and it had just shredded the last illusions of parity. For 40 years, the Soviets had dreamed of a fighter that could meet the West head-on. The Eagle never bothered to meet them. It simply flew higher, saw farther, and fired first. Today, decades after its first kill, the F-15 Eagle still flies. It has been upgraded, modernized, stretched into new forms like the F-15EX, but its heart remains unchanged, a machine built not just to fly, but to dominate. Its kill tally, over 100 air-to-air victories. Its loss rate in air-to-air combat, 0. No other jet in history carries a record like that. Around the world, the MiG-21, MiG-23, MiG-25, and MiG-29 gather dust in museums and airfields. Some are still flown by second-tier militaries. Some are parked in boneyards. Others have been refitted. But the lineage is clear. They were designed to fight in a world that no longer exists, a world where close-range combat mattered, where ground stations called the shots, where a fighter was only as good as the pilot's eyesight. But the Eagle erased that world. It killed from beyond vision, it flew beyond doctrine, and it proved, conclusively, that superiority isn't a dogfight, it's preemption. That's the ghost it left behind. In every combat simulation, every radar upgrade, every pilot syllabus, the shadow of the Eagle looms. Because it didn't just outperform Soviet jets, it outlived them, outlasted them, out-evolved them. It taught air forces that the next war would not be won by who turned tighter, but by who saw first and struck hardest. That lesson still echoes across the skies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And in Russia, where modern MiGs and Sukhois now carry more advanced radars, longer missiles, stealth coatings, there's one inescapable reality. They're still chasing the F-15, still trying to match a fighter built before the first iPhone, still trying to erase the loss felt in Lebanon, Iraq, and beyond, still haunted by what they once called too big, too heavy, too slow. Because in truth, the Soviets didn't fear the F-15 when they first saw it. They only feared it when it was too late.